Hello, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones, and I pastor a church in Indianapolis, Indiana called Northwood Christian Church, hence the name, Northwood Podcast. And today's episode is all about conflict or tension in our communities and the ways that we might actually ease this tension and move through it. I don't know if you've ever been in a community with someone with whom there was an issue. Actually, I know there was definitely someone that you had an issue with in your community, but maybe you were unable to name it, or neither of you were able to name it, and so maybe passive aggressive answers or silence. And this is human nature to avoid conflict, to shove it under a rug for another time. But Jesus would have us air it out and to deal with it. And we're going to talk more about that in a moment. But first, a few more words, housekeeping issues, really. I'm recording this at my church, as I mentioned before, is in Indianapolis, Indiana. And if you care to find out more about us, or if you're in the area, you might look us up, search for us online, and you'll find our website, which is www.ndncc.org, or just Google Northwood Christian Church, Indianapolis. Or if you'd like a more direct message, to write to me directly, my email is Heath, that's my name, Heath, at ndncc.org. I'm recording this, I should say, before I move on to the last point. I'm recording this in my church, where there are a couple schools in session, and so you might hear noise in the background and kids yelling and whatnot. And so if that happens, apologies for the distractions. Hopefully it won't be too distracting, and we'll push through it. Lastly, this podcast is produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network, and we are so grateful for them for producing it and distributing it, along with other podcasts created by Hoosiers in Indiana about topics of interest to Hoosiers, generally speaking. That's the All Indiana Podcast Network, and you can find more about them by visiting www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's www.wishtv.com/podcasts, and you can learn more about the All Indiana Podcast Network. And now moving on to where we're going. Here in a moment, anyway, we're going to be reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20 specifically. But first, we need to pause for some ads for our podcast audience. So if you're listening, we'll see you in a few moments. Or if you're watching on YouTube, well, here is an awkward pause. And we're back. And as I was saying, today we'll be going over a passage found in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 15 through 20. That's Matthew 18, 15 through 20. And it goes, "If your brother or sister sins against you, go and correct them when you are alone together. If they listen to you, then you've won over your brother or sister. But if they won't listen, take with you one or two others, so that every word may be established by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. But if they still won't pay attention, report it to the church. If they won't pay attention even to the church, treat them as you would a Gentile and tax collector. I assure you that whatever you fasten on earth will be fastened in heaven, and whatever you loosen on earth will be loosened in heaven. Again, I assure you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything you ask, then my Father who is in heaven will do it for you. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I'm there with them." This text begins with the line, "If another member of the church sins against you," or actually that's not how it begins, but somewhere in the middle it mentions if someone sins. And I think every sentence begins that way, if someone does this. And I want to say, if? If? Did Jesus say if? If he did, he's being too generous. He says if, when we all know that the word should be when conflict happens, especially in church. And I have observed more conflict, division, anger, and resulting heartache in churches than perhaps any other place. And I know that maybe you have too, if you've spent enough time in church, at least. In fact, much of my energy as a pastor has been spent in helping people through these horror stories. Oftentimes, or most times, the horror stories of church conflict are told by persons who have left the church. It gets that bad. And one can understand, especially after considering a passage like the one that we are considering today. about all the conflict. And as you read it, you may have thought of the examples in your own life where you felt the need to address conflict in your life or in your church. But today's passage wants us to consider how if things were different. What if conflict and tension in churches was dealt with in a direct, thoughtful, and graceful way? But alas, we dream. Or do we? Might things be different? Jesus thinks yes. But first, a story. One day I was going down the stairs at my last house before I moved to Indianapolis when I flipped the light switch only to hear a pop. And then I saw a bright spark, scared me senseless. And then, nothing. I kept flipping the switch, flick, 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 still nothing. And it felt kind of stiff, like I shouldn't be flicking it, but I still was. But still completely dead. So I went to the circuit board and I saw that the circuit had been tripped. So I flipped it back to on, only it wouldn't stay, kick right back. And those of you who know about these things will tell you that you should not keep flipping on a circuit switch if it keeps flipping back to off like that. But I didn't. I was ignorant. I just kept forcing it, thinking if I just will it to work, it will work. But what this means is that you have a short somewhere or something could be very wrong. But again, I didn't know this, although I should have suspected this. But anyway, I kept flipping the switch and even holding it in the on position until it became very clear that I had made the problem worse. Other things started kicking out. I noticed my refrigerator in the kitchen wasn't working, along with some other appliances. So something was now seriously wrong with the wiring in my house. And at that time, we did not have the resources to address the problem as one would or should hope to. So we just had to make do. We plugged in the appliances that we needed, like the refrigerator and others, into extension cords that we ran to plugs in other rooms, like in the dining room, I remember. And so we made it work. And at first, those bright extension cords, those orange extension cords that ran from the dining room into the kitchen, they were an eyesore, as you can imagine. And I'm sure they remained an eyesore, except at least I, stopped noticing them after a few weeks. And yes, I said weeks. We lived like that for weeks. Weeks went by. And the longer we put off the repairs, the more that continued to go wrong. But we just continued to adjust. But this became our reality. Extension cords, blinking lights, and entire circuits in the house that stopped working. And all of this at first made the house feel disheveled, sort of like a house that was under construction. And I said at first, but as I said before, in time, we stopped noticing the dysfunction. And yes, our house was in a state of dysfunction, but we lived with it until it felt like normal. But it wasn't normal. And eventually, we had a real electrician come and look things over, and he was appalled, and he found yards and yards of charred wires behind our walls, just behind our bed's headboard, where my wife and I slept, and adjacent to the room where our daughter slept. And he said that if oxygen had hit those cords, like if I opened the attic door or something, the whole house would have gone up like a tinderbox. And he kindly, patiently explained to me, the ignorant fool that I was, that going forward, he said something like, next time there's a problem, don't sit on it. You need to address these things or it will just get worse. And it's true of other things. We just had our air conditioner go out, same deal. The repairman said, you need regular maintenance and vigilance. The next time this happens, don't ignore the problem. Which is what I did with my AC until things really went kaput. It had been making a noise and I just thought, hey, probably be okay. Ignore. Eventually that noise became background noise and I stopped noticing. And I've learned that when I fail to address problems around my house, I pay for it later. A leaking roof will become worse. Do you hear water running in the bathroom that shouldn't be? You'd better find out why. Something wrong with the wires, as was in my case. Well, you'd better get to the bottom of it, because if you don't, you may end up with a far worse problem once you start tearing up the walls. What could have been a minor fix becomes a major and destructive problem. What could have been the equivalent of an outpatient procedure becomes a process that is more akin to open heart surgery, more serious, more messy, and with far higher stakes when you let these sleeping dogs lie. Where am I going with all of this? Well, I see striking parallels between the behavior I manifest as I deal with the problems around my house and the behavior that manifests in churches when tension in the community is not addressed. You've heard the stories before, or if you haven't, just listen to church folk in seminary. Those who had pastored churches before told their horror stories of anonymous letters sent to the church to tell the pastor why she or he was doing a terrible job. Like bad news out of the clear blue sky. No communication until things were pretty bad. Stories of pastors being fired outright, the pastor unawares that they had been offending the congregation for years. They didn't tell them. Stories about congregants who did not get along, could not speak to one another, and yet spoke about one another to just about anyone else who'd listen. You know, churches are notorious places for secrecy, gossip, and passive-aggressive behavior. And I say notorious, underline it. In the very space where we claim to bravely gather together to learn about truth and to tell the truths about ourselves and that are routinely hidden and ignored and or avoided. At church, we are committed to telling the truth. We fail to live up to that high calling. Well, today's passage from Matthew 18 can be viewed as an antidote to the problems that I've been describing. So let's dive back in to verse 15 where we began. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and correct them when you are alone together. Step 1. Now notice, this interaction does not begin with triangulation, which is to say it doesn't begin with a conversation to someone else about the other person you should be talking to. It begins with one member of the body consulting the other member of the body who is directly involved rather than someone who has little or nothing to do with the dispute. In short, step 1 is not gossip. It's not seeking validation in another. Step 1 is go straight to the source. Go to the one who has done you wrong or who you have an issue with. Maybe they haven't done you wrong. You just have something you need to talk about. And speak the truth when you are alone with that person. I mean, could you imagine how many problems would be solved, would end right there if that's the way we dealt with things? How many problems could be sorted out in this way if only people with grievances would talk to one another? So this one step alone could save a world of hurt. We almost could stop there if we could follow that one step. But we don't. And the text goes on to say, then you have won over your brother or sister. Well, I love that. Won over. This implies that restoration of bonds and that the intimacy between members of a gathering of Jesus followers is restored. And all of these things before things really get out of hand. So to lean into the metaphor I've been using, this would be as if I had immediately consulted help when my light switch blew the fuse. So many problems could have been prevented. Walls that needn't be torn up, wires that needn't be pulled. And in this passage in Matthew 18, Jesus is envisioning a community where grievances and conflicts, grudges, generally speaking, are named straight away, and not to some other third party that shouldn't have anything to do with it. The conversation occurs between the person who is aggrieved and the person who is responsible. And then there's this hopeful line at the end of verse 15, when they have come around, or something to that effect. When they have been reconciled is alluded to. So that's great. I wish we just had verse 15, but as I said just a moment ago, things don't always go so well. Sometimes the other person has a point of view or a perspective that even if you go directly to them, it doesn't mesh well with your own, at least not in short order. So now it's time, says Jesus, to bring a few other minds and hearts into the mix. Time for the wisdom of a few others to help shine some light on the situation. Or as the text puts it, if they won't listen, take with you one or two others so that every word may be established by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's verse 16. So here is an ancient recommendation that's being brought into play. The words in this verse would have sounded familiar to many who were first hearing them when Jesus taught these things. It's a recommendation made in their own Hebrew Bible in Deuteronomy 19, verse 15 specifically. But, it doesn't take a student of Scripture, or you needn't have ever heard that before, to see that this is just sound advice. And there's a lot packed in here, but sound advice. One may assume that the one or two persons that you bring into the conversation will be discerning and wise. There's the start. It'd be silly to bring in other people who are just as lost or confused as those seeking the advice. Also, when they assume that the intent is not to gang up on any individual. This would likely only result in more pain. So no, the intent must be to bring new ears into the conversation. That's it. The point also seems to be including others to bear witness to these things. I mean, you don't want either aggrieved party to come away from the conversation with a narrative that they can spin, twist, or even falsify. So having good, honest, good faith witnesses can help with that. Also, could be that with new voices entering into the conversation and new listening ears, both parties may come to better understand the nature of the rift, something they couldn't see before. The hope that here is that some outside perspectives may help the aggrieved parties see things with a wider lens so that they can come to some resolution that they can live with. Break up the logjam that they're stuck in so they can get some traction. Sometimes you need other ears and other voices, other opinions and insights to do that. But even still, things may not necessarily go well. Even when things are handled maturely, wisely, and in love, as we're describing, things do not always go as one would hope. I've been a part of processes that fell apart, even when we did things precisely as I'm describing. So at this point, it's time for the whole community to get involved, because they need to understand what is happening. The tension will be felt under the surface, or the story will contort and reform itself while shrouded in secrecy. Rumors may spread, and this is never good. So you want to have that conversation with your community. The text reads in verse 17, the first part of verse 17, but if they still won't pay attention, report it to the church, the ecclesia, the community, broadly speaking. Now keep in mind, by the time things have reached this point, those involved are fairly clear in their position. The lines have been drawn, been reflected on, wise persons have had input, and now it's time to just name the truth to the whole body. Because this whole thing, all of this conversation, is not just about the health of these individuals involved, but about the health of the entire body of Christ, of the entire local church involved here. And why? Because when there is pain and dissension buried in the body of Christ, the whole community is impacted. Even while some in the community are blissfully unawares, the body is being affected. Uncovered, untouched, unmitigated tension in a church pulls things apart slowly or sometimes quickly. And then years later, when those who are left, they look up, they cannot understand the landscape before them, the landscape that has been rent apart because God's people could not have these conversations, these hard conversations about themselves and the issues that they have with one another. And so communities instead are encouraged to address these big issues together in a more transparent way. Jesus says, you try to deal it directly with the individual, you bring in a few people, the problem is still boiling, now it's time to talk to the community at large, so that it doesn't blow up and hurt everyone. So by the time this situation has been brought to the whole group, one can assume that whatever has been done against the brother or sister that is being talked about here, it's no trifle, must be something serious. So it's time for the community to deal with this serious matter and the implications, and to discover together what the roadmap to healing may look like. So the next step reads, the back half of verse 17, if they won't pay attention even to the church, treat them as you would a Gentile and tax collector. Now, upon first blush, these words seem especially harsh. Some of those present may have thought so as well, those first hearing these words. Treat them as you would a Gentile or a tax collector. Jesus' community wasn't supposed to interact with the likes of these. So is Jesus telling us that one of the steps to dealing with tension in our churches is to ostracize offending parties, to cut them off and send them out? And simply put, the answer is no. Because I'll remind you that one of Jesus' very disciples was in fact a tax collector. And that one was welcomed in. And Gentiles were treated by Jesus consistently, sought out consistently by Jesus, and treated consistently with love, compassion, and acceptance. And this was a major part of Jesus' ministry, bringing near to him those who would be shunned and rejected by others. So just as is the case with sinners and Gentiles, our communities are to treat the one who will not be reconciled through these ways that we've been talking about. We will treat that one with love, kindness, and grace, just as Jesus has treated outsiders since the beginning, leaving open avenues to forgiveness and reconciliation in the future. So maybe they won't reconcile now, but if you keep those doors open is the point. So no, these verses do not call us to cut someone off or to cast them out. Rather, they call us to an even greater love and greater patience. Next, in verse 18, Jesus repeats some lines that we read back in chapter 16 a few weeks ago. And in that story, Jesus had told Peter that whatever he bound or loosened on earth would be bound or loosened in heaven. And I don't want to dwell over long on this portion because it's liable to send us off on a tangent. Suffice it to say, hear this. The main point, by using this language, Jesus is implying that our relationships have a timeless, eternal quality. Whatever happens here on earth matters in the life to come. That the loving relationships that draw people together here have a lasting, even everlasting quality to them. Conversely, so do our relationships that are not loving. In other words, how well we deal with conflict inside of a church community has a significant impact on the world around it and even the worlds in our future. Turns out these relationships that we build and tear apart are as eternal as the love of God, for better or for worse. Setting that aside, what comes next is perhaps the most well-known lines from this passage. And I'll just read them, verses 19 and 20. So a little bit of a longer reading here, and you heard them before, so bear with me. But it goes, "Again, I assure you that if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, then my Father who is in heaven will do it for you. For where two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there with them." End quote. And it's that last line, where two or three are gathered in my name, I'm there, that people tend to know the most from this passage. And it's good news. If you can pull it off, if you can even convince two, maybe three, to come together in the name of love, then God is there. And so then you have entered into the presence of the divine. And much is made of these verses because they provide us a simpler idea of what church may be. I can remember these verses being quoted from pulpits in my youth. Wherever two or three are gathered, then God is there and will even answer the needs of the community. And this, in a smaller church, may be a way for us to feel maybe better about ourselves. You have at least two or three here. Now you've got a church. That's all you need. Pat yourself on the back. Whatever it takes to get by. But let's not lose sight of what this passage has been about from the beginning, because this line is really about that. The two or three who are gathered here are those who have now gone through the reconciliation process. And that's how they're able to gather and to find God's Spirit there moving amongst them. That's the point. You want God's Spirit of love flowing through a community where two or three or more are gathered. Then you need to go through this process of telling the truth, tough conversations, bringing in outside voices, ways to reconciliation. And what brings the Spirit of God near in this passage is that love that has been shaped in the group because they were willing to face the hard truths, to name truths, and to work through this tension together. And there's nothing magical, I don't think, about the numbers 2 or 3. What makes them magic here are the bonds that form when those 2, 3, or more members of the community are willing and able to tell the truth to one another, to name differences of opinion and to work through them. That's what makes 2 or 3 gathering together so special when it works. But first, tell the truth. Face the truth. Name the hard things that need named. This is necessary inside of church and out. Every community should reconsider its history and wonder how things might have been if it had had the capacity to tell the truth to one another early on, before it's too late. How many relationships, friendships, or marriages could have been saved? Tell the truth. Tell the truth. But this leaves me anxious. Because there are reasons we don't speak the truth. There are reasons we hide the truth from one another and even ourselves. It's hard to confront those who've harmed us, so we'd rather let sleeping dogs lie. But they do not sleep forever. And back to the metaphor of a house and the walls needing tearing up. Eventually, you may need to look inside the walls, tear them open to find what's underneath, for good or for ill. And putting it off will likely make the problem worse. Sometimes my wife tells me the truth about myself, and I don't like it. My kids are at an age where they're beginning to, in their own way, tell me the truth about myself, and what they reveal sometimes hurts. It's hard for me to hear, but I am better for knowing the truth about myself. I'm in therapy, which is helping, and I'm trying to have more direct conversations with everyone in community with me, including those at our church. And I've not always done the best, but I'm trying to do better. But this passage is not about individuals so much as about life in the community together. So I suppose I should ask, what does this passage mean for our church, specifically at Northwood? Or if you're listening to this and go to another church, what might this mean for your church? You who have been at that church longer, perhaps have keener insights into this question. But I've been around my church long enough by now to notice that there is tension here. Some of us may not think there is, but there is. I occasionally hear, through the grapevine, stories about issues different congregants have with one another or with me. Usually, as I said, through the grapevine, not direct. Because we are very nice to one another and we truly care for one another, but there is often an unnamed tension in our community. Ours is not unique, but ours, not being unique, has these problems, minor or major grievances. But conflict is not the only form of tension that we do not always name. I like to broaden it here. This passage just seems to be about conflict, but I think that also naming grief is another big one. Grief from past losses, and we bottle that up too, just like we bottle up conflict. Grief over those who have died, grief over former, now lost versions of our church that older members remember with nostalgia. Unnamed or unprocessed grief, and this brings tension into communities, and then anger, and then conflict. So deal with the grief. Or how, if we were able to talk with one another about this at least. Another form of tension that I've noticed is anxiety about the church's future, our church specifically and the church broadly. I've learned that many of you sit with your anxiety along these lines alone. But how if we were able to talk about this directly? First to one or two others, then as a group? How if we were able to talk openly about these things in a way that brought us together? Whatever the tension, whatever the issue. What I take away from today's passage is the importance of clearly and directly speaking our truths to one another before they bottle up, before they build up, before the pressure becomes too great, before they become destructive, these truths that we keep inside. The truth is supposed to set us free, and it will, but first, speak it. And if you have an issue with someone at church, that's the perfect place to rediscover a better way to relate. Could there even be a better place? After all, church is supposed to be something akin to our spiritual training facility. It's one of the places where it should be the easiest for us to live into the way of Jesus. And the world is full of conflict and tensions, named and unnamed. And we in our churches have an opportunity here to serve as an example to those in the surrounding communities. In a world filled with conflict and tension, we have an opportunity to show them a different way by modeling this passage well. And as we grow, we have the ability to stay on top of this, naming the hard truths as we move along, always before things boil over, before the tension becomes so great that the community no longer functions, no longer communicates, no longer speaks to one another candidly and in direct ways about what matters. Our conflicts, our grief, our anxieties, they will not take care of themselves, just like my fried wires in the walls that needed to be torn up. But the good news is we can do it different. Today in this passage, Jesus calls us to do it different. So what is your truth to speak? Here at Northwood, or at your church, or at home, or at your place of work? What words have you kept from the ears that most need to hear them? Then pray for courage and speak the truth. Address these tensions head on. Gracefully, tactfully, but head on. Bring other wise voices into the mix, and if they will not listen, treat them with love and patience until they may come around. Or if you are the one who needs to hear the hard truth about yourself, have the courage and humility to face in yourself what you must, to hear what another may say about you, to you, in love, and to consider, is it true, and what does it imply about me, and what ways do I need to do different and to be better? To allow yourself to discover your crossed wires so that the divine carpenter can begin their good work. If you cannot face the truth about yourself, you'll never grow as a person. And I think that it's time for us to grow together. This has been the Northwood Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen, or leave a comment. These points of engagement drive more traffic our way. Or check out our website, www.indyncc.org. And also check out the other podcasts produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Northwood Podcast. I am Heath Jones. Peace.